Well, hello and welcome to Generational Wellbeing with Dr. Lum. I am Dr. Lum Furundi, and joining me today is Dr. Nishi Bhopal, who is an integrative psychiatrist and sleep medicine doctor. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Okay, so we talked about importance of family dynamics and mental health in our previous YouTube channel. Please go back and watch because she threw some really amazing tips. But today we're really going to talk about intergenerational trauma because that's something that's impacting a lot of people and we're really not aware of. So Dr. Bhopal is going to help us understand what is intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back on. And yeah, in our last video, we were talking about some of the family dynamics. And so intergenerational trauma really informs those family dynamics. So what it is, it refers to the transmission of the effects of trauma through the generations. So those effects of trauma can be psychological, they can be emotional, they can be cultural, and they go from one generation to the next, right? So it's almost like you're inheriting these emotional scars from previous generations. And what is so interesting about intergenerational trauma is that even if you yourself have not experienced those specific traumas, it can still have an effect on how you go through the world psychologically. It can also have an effect on your mental health. And there are studies showing that generations past, if it was like the trauma happened generations ago, the children, who in later generations from that family lineage have a higher rate of anxiety and depression and trauma-like symptoms, right? And there might even be other physical manifestations of that as well. So that's why it's such an important thing to recognize.
Absolutely. Can you give us some examples of the kinds of trauma?
Yeah, so we can think about trauma in terms of like historical traumas.
Mm.
So maybe it was related to, like I can share from my own family background. So my family originally came from India and they survived the partition of India in 1947, right? So for my grandparents' generation, they had to flee what was Pakistan at the time in 1947 with just like the clothes on their back and they had to run because their village was being burned down, right? So
Right.
that is a huge trauma, right? So it can be a historical event like that. It also could be related to things like, genocide that have happened in a country, maybe colonization of a country. Of course, slavery, is a big trauma. But there can also be other types of traumas that have happened. So, for example, if there was a history of maybe sexual abuse that was happening in a family. So it doesn't have to be a big cultural event like the ones I just mentioned. So all of these things can count as traumas. The Holocaust, of course, is a big one as well. And that's where a lot of the research has been done on intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, a lot of things you're mentioning, things that we look at it as history, but we're not really connecting how it is affecting us, individuals, and in families too, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, like we talked about in the last video, some of the cultural dynamics in families can be quite subtle. And the same thing applies here with intergenerational trauma, especially as your generations removed, right? So if this happened, many generations ago before you were born, it might feel like, well, why is that relevant to me now, right? Like this
Right.
happened so long ago. But some of the beliefs and some of the coping skills, the coping mechanisms that people adopted generations ago can be passed down. And in the last video, we talked about this belief that the world is not safe, right? And so
Right.
you can see how that could easily get passed down from generation to generation. And you might not know where that even came from, but it could be
Right.
really rooted in that historical trauma.
Right, right. So what are some symptoms of that though? I know you have that belief. Are there certain symptoms that or behavioral patterns that you will see in those cases?
Yeah, so you might see things like conflict avoidance. Okay, so like where let's say there's some issue in the family and maybe the dynamic is like no 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 don't upset anyone, don't talk to them about it, because there could be this fear of conflict that may be stemming from like when there were real physical threats in the past. So it might feel really unsafe to address conflict. There may be patterns of secret keeping that come up in a family, like, okay, let's just not say anything to anyone. We have to keep this safe, keep it secret. What are people going to think about us? We're going to be ostracized from the community. That also may be rooted in trauma. right? There may be attachment patterns that show up. So what that means is there's maybe a fear of abandonment, maybe a lot of anxiety and codependency. So what that can look like practically is, okay, let's not upset so-and-so in the family. Let's not upset dad. Like, let's tiptoe around and walk on eggshells, because if he gets upset, then it's bad for everybody. So those kinds of codependent dynamics. Or another dynamic is enmeshment. So that's where people feel like they can't have their own identity within the family system. So, this is how we do things. This is what we believe. And you have to kind of follow that party line within the family. And so if someone wants to deviate from that, so for example, here's like a concrete example of what that might look like,
Yeah.
is like, okay, all of our family are doctors, and you want to be an artist? No, we don't do that in our family, right? So
Right.
like that's kind of like an example of like enmeshment and how that might show up, right? And you
Right.
might not
Right.
think, well, what does that have to do with trauma? But if you trace it back, you can start to see how those beliefs would get passed down.
Right, right. Amazing. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot, and it's very, again,
Mhm.
it's something, as you said, mentioning those examples. I'm like, I've seen that before. I do that, or I know this family that does it, and we don't really realize that it's something that has been going on, and it just continue as this is how we function as a family, and then we end up with a lot of a trauma, again, enter with conflicts within the family that causes a lot of anxiety, again, stress, and then kind of it's just a vicious cycle, and we're not sure how to just get that ball to stop rolling.
Exactly, exactly. And this is where, as the person who has maybe grown up with that, whether, you're thinking about your child or you're thinking about yourself, this is where people can start to become anxious. They might experience depression. They might experience burnout. And in the patients that we work with in my practice, we'll see people coming in with these feelings of like, I don't know why I just never feel good enough, or I feel like I'm letting people down all the time, or I'm like I'm working so hard, but I'm not achieving the things that I want to achieve, or I just feel ashamed. I'm worried about telling my family that, I don't want to go to law school. I I want to open a restaurant, right? And there's so much internal conflict around these kinds of, issues. And so that's why it is really important. I mean, not just from a theoretical framework to understand, okay, yeah, intergenerational trauma exists, but the consequences of it are very real in individual people's lives.
Right, right. A lot of emotional trauma there too, because you have to fit within a certain box in that family where if you step outside of the box, you're the off ball, or you're the, yeah, there are so many different names for that one person who is trying to become who they were created to be and follow their own design, right? But
Yes.
sometimes that does not really translate well with the others. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you have someone who's like, yeah, I can relate, what can they start doing? Like, what would you recommend for them to get to that or start that process of healing?
Yeah. So, the first thing that I generally recommend is starting to build awareness around it. And so what that means is tuning into yourself and just starting to understand yourself a little bit better. And like there are tools that I like to use online where maybe you just download a vocabulary sheet of different feelings. So I think it's sometimes hard for people to even identify what they're feeling. So like we give this to our patients where you can just get this PDF. If you just Google feelings vocabulary, you can just start identifying, oh, okay, this is what I'm feeling in a more granular way. And that can give you some insight into, what might be going on within yourself. Doing some journaling around it can be helpful. Sometimes talking to a therapist if you feel like the issues are kind of like out of reach for you, or if they just feel really big and it's hard for you to get a handle on things, and talking to a professional can be very helpful. Talking to your kids about it, right? So just not necessarily about the trauma, but just, encouraging them to start developing that awareness and resiliency within themselves of like, hey, what are you feeling? How can you start to cultivate a sense of agency for yourself where it's okay to be a little bit different, right? It's okay to make decisions that maybe your family doesn't approve of. And that can be very, very hard to do. And so that's where getting support around that can be helpful.
Yes, yes, I like the feelings part. I'm glad you brought that up because we started a few years ago. We had like the feelings charts in every exam room, and that way, and we in our handouts starting from age 2, I think, where you'll be amazed at how at as young as that they can start identifying it. But even as we did that, there were some parents who could not really like, I don't know what that is. So it takes time, but there's still so many people who were not able to really like, what do you want? I don't know. It's never
Yeah.
been my life. It's been for everybody else. It's been for my kids. It's been for my father, my sister. But what do you want? I really don't know because of those things that I'm like, okay, it's never been about me. So that's huge, being aware and journaling. And what if there's someone who says, "Well, I've never journaled before. I don't know how to journal." What would you tell them?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So journaling is one tool, right? So
Yeah.
it's not for everybody, but it's so helpful. And so what I recommend to people, okay, if you've never done it before, you can actually Google journaling prompts. So if you just Google that, you can find different prompts that'll give you questions to journal on, right? But what I tell people, even if you don't want to do that, is just grab a piece of paper. You can even just make columns on it, right? Make some boxes on it and just put different categories. So the categories could be like family, work, um, pets, hopes and dreams. You can have all these big categories and just start doing a brain dump. Like whatever comes to mind, just write it out. And even if that is hard to do, if you're like, oh, I don't even know what to write in those categories, then all you can do is simply just open up your journal and just write whatever it is you're thinking about that day. So, for example, it could be, okay, I have to take the kids to the dentist tomorrow at 9 a.m., right? It could be as simple as that, whatever is just going on in your mind, and let it free flow. And the more you get into the habit of like getting that out of your head onto paper, the more it'll flow, right? The more it'll come out, but it's just a matter of getting started. But just keep it simple. Like it doesn't have to be this, grand essay or anything that you're writing. No one's going to read it.
Right.
But just like keep it really simple for yourself and don't put too much pressure around it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because we don't want to go to the other side of overwhelm, anxiety, but that will also help you dump your thoughts onto paper. That could actually help your sleep as well. Because sometimes, at the end of the day, you have a list of things that were not done from the day before, and the things you start planning the next day before you have to go to sleep, and it's like, oh, I'm awake. I might as well just go and do it. So that could be helpful too, maybe before going to bed, right?
Absolutely. And what I tell people is don't do it right before bed because what can happen is it gets you thinking and then it can activate the mind. So what I suggest to people is do it at least a couple of hours before bedtime. So maybe if you have a natural transition, like let's say between your workday and your evening, that's a good time to do it, or like right after dinner or something like this. But sometimes right before bed can be a little bit too stimulating. But I also do suggest for like when you were saying, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have to do all these things, have a pen and paper at your bedside so that if you do think of something, you can just write it down. Like, oh my gosh, I have to remember not to, or like, yeah, don't forget to take the trash out tomorrow or something. Just write it down so that way your brain isn't trying to hold on to it. And it's just a way you can like, alleviate some of that anxiety.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you. This was absolutely helpful. If there's someone else who's out here and they're like, oh, this is an interesting topic. I think I need help. I think my family needs the help. Where can they find you?
Sure. So people can go to our website, pacificintegrativepsych.com, and we've got information on there about what we do. And then we have a YouTube channel as well at Pacific Integrative Psych, where we talk about different topics related to mental health and holistic mental health care.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me yet again. We'll have a wonderful day.
Thank you.